about the use of robotics in endovascular procedures. And I'm going to broaden this out a little bit and talk about robots and how we use them in our practice basically on a daily basis. Okay, so again, just a reminder of the symposium, and we're going to talk a little bit about robotics. And I have the same disclosures. This particularly involves Siemens and Corindus. So let's talk a little bit about this. Is the robots that we use in the operating room on a daily basis. And these include the one I've already introduced, a robot which acquires middle cerebral artery signal, the robotic imaging system, a robotic viewing system, and then we'll talk about the robotic catheters that we utilize. This is our research lab, and we think of this as no patients in this. This is all for imaging and robotic development. We think of robotics as being intimately related to imaging. There's no point in having great 3D imaging if we don't have 3D catheter control. Likewise, 3D catheter control is not of limited value if we don't basically have 3D imaging. And so this is what we call our imaging, navigation, and robotics laboratory. And behind those steel doors is an MRI, and increasingly we're developing MR-guided interventions, which we think will be important. The robotic imaging system that you've heard about, the Zigo earlier today, and the Pheno, were really an example of what we describe as the other guy's toolkit. It came really from the automobile industry in Germany, and these were the robots that are used in car assembly plants. This is exactly the same technology that was built into these imaging systems. And the reason for doing that is because it allows flexibility in the movement of the imaging system and allows fairly rapid spinning around the patient, as I showed you earlier, which minimizes the amount of motion disturbance really which actually occurs. And so you can see the robotic arm is actually exactly the same. It is called the KUKA robot, and that's how it was developed into this particular system with Siemens. And this was the first generation of robotic imaging system. And as I've showed you, this has now been changed. And the Pheno is a robot that we use every day, and it has a much bigger space between the radiation source and the detector, and allows much more rapid motion. It can go much faster than that, but the speed of rotation is limited by the FDA because of the risk potentially to other personnel who are around that system. Again, if you look at it, it looks very like its brother that was on car assembly lines. But if you look around this room, and we'll talk a little bit more about hybrid rooms, there are cameras, above where we record everything that we do in these rooms. And if you look at DICET, it stands for DeBakey Institute for Cardiovascular Education and Training. All of the videos that we create for education and procedural videos are all posted on that DICET YouTube channel for anybody around the world to actually look at. And we'll talk a little bit about those robots. This is what it looks like when you take all the draping off and what it looks like, in that system, and how you can create that motion to create 3D acquisitions. But on the bottom of that system, there was a catheter robot, and we got into this via what you're looking at on the two left panels. This was the original endovascular robot, which was created by Hansen. The original system was designed for left atrial ablation for patients with AFib. And when I saw that, you could see that our electrophysiologist in a beating heart could move a robotic catheter 1 or 2 millimeters to the left and absolutely control the amount of pressure being applied to the atrial wall so that they could reliably deliver energy without perforating the heart. And it was very obvious that they had the degree of control that we didn't have. And so we were heavily involved in the development of the peripheral platform. And on the bottom left, if we look, this is an example. This is a robotic catheter. This is a patient with a complex renal artery stenosis that had been failed manual standing both from below and from above by my partners. And that yellow line is from the image fusion, creating the CAT scan. And simply by aligning the robot with what we think of as a glide path, we actually crossed that lesion first time with the robot and successfully went over and treated the patient. Now this is an example, this is a video, hopefully this one will run, and you can see that basically this was an example of what we presented was a patient who had a complex type 2 endoleak and an enlarging false lumen and persisting pain. And again, we CT scanned the patient, we planned a glide path and the approach to this because there was no direct access into this complex flow pattern through that false lumen. It originated at a superior intercostal artery, flowed down through the false lumen because we subsequently treated it with a stent graft, and it flowed out through the celiac artery, and the septum precluded any kind of direct access to it. And you can see this complex lesion flowing down, and at the end it flows straight out through the celiac artery. And so using CT scanning planning, what we planned to do was perforate through the septum into the false lumen, but there was a relatively limited window to do this. And this was the advantage of using the robot, is the robot allowed us to very precisely position the robot at the bottom end of the catheter. And using a needle, we perforated into that false lumen. And this is how you plan this in multiplanar reconstruction. You can see where the celiac artery is coming from the bottom end of that false lumen. And using a needle, we could actually plan to place this from the true lumen into the false lumen and thereby successfully embolize the false lumen. I think time precludes me from letting this entire video run, so I'm just going to go on and show you another example. This is a patient you can see has a leiomyosarcoma of the inferior vena cava with this huge mass projecting into the right atrium. And using image fusion, the MR, you can fuse MR in exactly the same way as a CT scan. And using the robot, we actually basically placed the robotic catheter, and through this we actually did a biopsy of the leiomyosarcoma. And so we've published fairly extensively on the use of the robot for inferior vena cava filter retrieval. In the middle, you can see an angiovac. By placing the robot inside the lumen of it, it provides steerability to something that was otherwise really unsteerable. And here's an example of a renal arteriovenous malformation, very high flow system where the robotic catheter gave us very precise stabilization. The problem, and what we were particularly interested in this robotics lab, was combining 3D imaging. When we look at a center line, think of a center line as a glide path for the robot. And underneath the table, much like in the electrophysiology world, we have an electromagnetic generator. And Hansen, unfortunately, basically was subsequently sold and bought by Auris, and they converted this basically into an endobronchial robot, which is now being sold. It's exactly the same technology. So they stopped the development of the endovascular robot. They switched exactly the same system. You do a CAT scan of the bronchi, and then the pulmonologist controls these robots, and this allows them to get much further out into the periphery. This company just sold for $3.5 billion. And so we're hoping that now that they've got a product, they will refocus onto the other set of tubes, in other words, blood vessels, by which we can actually utilize this. And so at the present time, basically the only catheter robot that can be used in the endovascular space happens to be the Corindus robot. Before talking a little bit about this, the whole idea is that when you put electromagnetic sensors into these robots, without using any radiation, we can actually model those catheters, and you can watch these catheters. This is under fluoro. If we take the fluoro off and use electromagnetic sensing, you can actually see how these catheters move throughout the vascular system. What was done at Methodist in the last 3 weeks was the first time that microcatheters were driven using a robotic control system inside the head. And this is an area of great optimism because of the lack of the number of neurointerventionalists for treating stroke. The question is, can our stroke interventionalists control a catheter in a remote site and revascularize and then ship these patients? And so to finish, this is the promise of this, really. If this runs here, let me go back one more time. I'm going to go back and finish off with that last one. was that this was the first time ever that an autonomous movement of a robot. This is a model of an aneurysm with a 3D reconstruction, and we could impute the coordinates into that robot. It would interrogate the renal artery and then move autonomously into it. And so the hope is basically in the future, number one, robotics may lend itself to off-site remote interventions, particularly potentially in areas where specialists such as stroke interventionists do not exist, and that we can combine these different combinations. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present to you today.